This video will demonstrate that Hebrews 1:3 is a mistranslation, making Jesus the exact imprint of God, but the underlying Greek does not contain the word exact. Please continue watching as we expand this summary and much more. In biblical interpretation, it's important to consult the context. The previous two verses say, "Long ago, at many times, and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son." Let's pause there. The author of Hebrews emphasizes that in the Old Testament, God communicated primarily through the prophets, while God additionally communicated through angels, judges, and ordinary people. The author of Hebrews is setting up a contrast with verse 2, which starts with the word but. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. Because of God's unprecedented holiness contrasted to our sinfulness, if God were to appear to be for any of us in the flesh, we would die. Before the fall, Adam walked and talked with God. After the fall, God used intermediaries who spoke for God. The author of Hebrews is communicating that God used a different intermediary in the New Testament to speak for Himself. The verse says, "He has spoken to us by His Son." Because Jesus spoke for God, He was God's agent and not the God that He spoke for. The doctrine of the Trinity wrongly teaches that God Himself came down, dwelt, and spoke to us. But the verse again states that God spoke to us by the prophets, but in these last days, He, speaking of God, has spoken to us by His Son. Because Jesus spoke for God, He is not to be mistaken for the God that He represented. The distinction between God as absolute God and Jesus Christ as God's representative is clear when Trinitarian presuppositions are not projected into the New Testament. For there is one God and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. The verse continues, "Whom He," speaking of God, "appointed the heir of all things." Because God appointed Jesus as heir, Jesus is not the God who made Him heir. Because Jesus was made heir, He formerly was not heir. If Jesus was fully God, He could not be given an inheritance that He did not already possess. Verse 2 concludes, "Through whom also He created the world." Here we have a purposeful mistranslation. The word created should be the verb made, and the word world should be the plural noun ages. It should say, "Through whom also He made the ages." Here are some quotes from Trinitarian scholars who acknowledge this is the correct interpretation. However, the author literally wrote, "Through whom He made the ages." The Son of God, through whom also He made the ages. The Greek word translated world in Hebrews 1:2 is better translated ages. He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and through whom He made the universe, literally framed the ages. The Greek word rendered worlds in Hebrews 1:2 does not mean the material world, but the ages, as it is usually translated elsewhere. Since so many Trinitarians admit that the verse literally states, "made the ages," why are these scholars not outraged at such a mistranslation? I believe that because the God of Trinitarians is Jesus Christ, it's more exalting for their Jesus to be the one God who created the heavens and the earth of Genesis 1:1 than to be the intermediary agent through whom also He made the ages. The passage continues, "He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature, and He upholds the universe by the word of His power. After making purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high." The word radiance further identifies Jesus. This Greek word is only found once in the New Testament. According to a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early literature, in ancient Greek writings, this word is usually passive. A passive meaning of radiates is a reflection from another source. For example, a mirror radiates from another source. In Hebrews 1:3, the meaning is passive because Christ reflects the glory of God the Father. Similarly, in Philippians 2:6, Christ is in the form of God. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, Christ is the image of God. The words of God are not in the Greek as this interlinear demonstrates. While I am not denying that God is implied here, translations should faithfully mirror the original Greek unless it's necessary to add or subtract words when translating. To their credit, both the New King James Version and the New American Standard do not include the words of God. We've now arrived at an extraordinary Trinitarian exaggeration, which all major translations participate in. Because the doctrine of the Trinity teaches that Jesus is literally God Himself, popular translations dishonestly mistranslated this verse to match this theology. In the Greek, the word representation is one word. The added word exact is an adjective that modifies the word representation and strikingly changed the meaning of the verse. There is an astonishing difference between being an exact imprint and being an imprint or representation of something or someone. We are made in the image of God, but we are not made in the exact image of God. Millions of Christians unknowingly read Trinitarian exaggerations into their Bibles. In the Greek, BDAG assigns three possible meanings for this word. The category of meaning they assigned for Hebrews 1:3 is something produced as a representation or reproduction. Based on this definition, Jesus is a representation of God and therefore not the God He represents. This meaning is contextually in harmony with Jesus being the radiance or reflection of the glory of God, which we already discussed. The following strike-throughs corrected this extraordinary exaggeration. And the imprint of His nature, the representation of His nature, and the image of His person, and the representation of His being. The ESV in the New American Standard translates the Greek word hypothesis as nature. This Greek word has a wide range of meaning, yet it is difficult to define with precision within the context. This word, person, which the Old and New King James use, or the word being as found in the NIV, are preferred because they are more general in light of contextual ambiguity. Verse 3, He is the radiance of the glory and the imprint of His nature, and He, speaking of Jesus, upholds the universe by the word of His power. Is the word His the power of Jesus or of God? That is, does Jesus uphold the universe by His own power, or does He uphold the universe by God's power? To answer this question, it's helpful to engage the preceding embedded clause, which has a similar grammatical arrangement. Please notice the similarity starting with the first clause. He, speaking of Jesus, is the radiance of the glory of God and the imprint of His, God's, nature. Now let's go to the next clause. He, speaking of Jesus, upholds the universe by the word of His power. The pronoun His in both clauses is the identical Greek word in the third person. In the first and second embedded clause, the pronoun He again describes Jesus. The word his in the first clause describes God. If we continue this parallelism, the word his describes God, where Jesus upholds the universe by God's power. This interpretation is consistent with the context because Jesus was appointed heir by God. Jesus is God's agent who made the ages. Jesus is the reflection of God's glory. Because modern translations make Jesus the exact imprint of God, they cloud that Jesus upholds the universe by God's power. The verse concludes, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Here is another distinction between God and Jesus. God is called the Majesty on high, which is never a title applied to Jesus. Jesus is described as the one seated on the right hand of God on the central throne. Thank you for watching this video. Please like it if you found it beneficial, and subscribe for more videos. Please follow the footsteps of Jesus Christ, who leads his sheep to his Father's house. May the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ bless you, beloved, as you follow his word and his dear Son.